Well, hello everyone. On behalf of Access Now, RightsCon, and our co-sponsor of this event, BSR, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us to talk about transparency reporting. 10 years ago, Google released a public report, the first of its kind, detailing how they responded to government's requests for user data. Since then, other companies have followed suit. Access Now launched our Transparency Reporting Index in 2014 to compile these reports and highlight trends. And the index has noted over 70 companies worldwide releasing transparency reports. However, some challenges still remain. Though transparency reporting has become more common for tech companies, non-tech companies who increasingly use and hold our data have not caught on to the practice. And within the tech sector, fewer companies have been consistently releasing reports. The larger picture of reporting also presents important questions. Over the last 10 years, has transparency reporting truly been effective in holding government surveillance in check? And how has reporting aided in trust building between companies and their users? The goal of this event is to reflect on these questions and more, to note gaps that need to be filled, and to look ahead to the future of transparency reporting. We're grateful to the wide range of speakers who have joined us today to address these topics. As you can see, we have a very packed agenda for the next 90 minutes, and we encourage you to keep the conversation going after the event. Please feel free to share your questions for our speakers in the chats, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the Q&A section. It's now my pleasure to welcome Nicole Carlebach, the Global Head of Business and Human Rights of Verizon, and Michael Samway, President of the BHR Group, to join us today to talk about the early stages of transparency reporting.
Thank you, Esedua, and thank you to Access Now and to BSR for co-sponsoring this important and timely event. Nicole and I have worked together for nearly a decade, and we have had long, winding discussions about technology and human rights, and we have also had brief and urgent discussions on matters of freedom of expression and privacy across the world. So we'll try to condense those two types of discussions into a fireside chat in just a few minutes, and we hope it sets the stage for a deeper discussion over the next 90 minutes. So thank you again to Access and BSR. So let's begin, Nicole. I think it would be helpful if you give us more background on yourself and your role. You're the head of global business and human rights at a major technology and media company. And then if you can set the stage and give us context on how your role interacts with the concept of transparency and why it's important to the company.
Yeah, so thank you to Access and also to BSR for having us. And thanks, Michael. I'm looking forward to a conversation with you today on these topics. As you said, I head up the Business and Human Rights program at Verizon. We're a dedicated team providing centralized leadership and guidance on the ways our core business, products, services, operations, strategy intersect with human rights issues, including issues like privacy, free expression, the right to be free from discrimination. And in our efforts, we're building on a foundation for this work that began at Yahoo over a decade ago, which I know you know a little bit about. So while the core of our approach to managing, addressing, considering the human rights impacts of our business hasn't changed all that much in these last few years, the issues that we're managing, I think it's fair to say, have considerably evolved and arguably become more challenging and more complex. And I think the year 2020, of course, has been like no other in terms of highlighting societal challenges, and also the role of technology in our daily lives has been perhaps never so evident and never so important as it is now. So as a result of all of this, the responsible development and deployment of technology that takes account of human rights considerations, I think, has become increasingly paramount. And so the conversation that we're having today about transparency reporting in this space, I think, is very timely, as well in light of the fact that we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs. And, despite that there's been, I think, significant growth in the business and human rights field broadly over the past decade, and that connections in particular between tech and human rights have become better understood, there's still room to go in mainstreaming these topics across business, within organizations, and more broadly. And part of that is sharing information, communication, and being transparent. So transparency reporting being a critical part of that, it's sort of a unique time to be discussing these issues in that wider context. And of course, Michael, you've worked with companies, with civil society, with governments in the field of tech and human rights, over this last decade and even beyond that. So maybe you could share a bit about your background, some of your work, and give us your sense about the origins of transparency reporting and, how it's evolved over time.
Thank you, Nicole. And you've really covered kind of the present and the importance and timeliness of this topic now. And I'll try to rewind the clock about 20 years to the early 2000s. And I guess I should begin by saying that I currently do public policy advisory work for tech companies and for civil society organizations on tech and human rights. I teach as an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and probably most relevantly for this discussion, I was at Yahoo for 10 years and was a deputy general counsel. I was there from 2000 to 2010. So the early and mid 2000s was really a period of global expansion for the technology companies that existed at the time. So I would say principally Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, hardware companies like Cisco. That led to what are some now well-documented challenges in international markets, including China. That in turn led to a call for a code of conduct around freedom of expression and privacy. There were intensive negotiations that culminated in the 2008 launch of the Global Network Initiative, a multi-stakeholder initiative made up of technology companies, civil society members, press freedom advocates, socially responsible investors, and academics. And a cornerstone of the GNI was and is accountability. And a core component of accountability is transparency. So if I could just offer one anecdote, I recall where I was, although not the exact date. We were in the offices of the Center for Democracy and Technology in early 2010, and a colleague from Google approached us in this small, confidential, kind of trusted setting and announced that Google would be issuing a report. It was not yet called a transparency report, but would be issuing a report giving information on the law enforcement demands that Google had received, and it would include information on numbers of disclosures and types of disclosures. And I have to say, at the time, given that I had worked closely and regularly with Yahoo's global law enforcement team on public safety, national security related issues, and speech and privacy issues, I was surprised. I thought it was bold. And I have to admit that there was concern in the industry. But I looked 10 years later, and I think that is the norm. It's a standard across industry. If I can misuse kind of a public policy concept, Google essentially shifted the Overton window. And I should also note that there was successful, important advocacy by groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, CDT itself, and others who had pushed for transparency, in particular on the US side. And Google really took a bold step. And what I want to kind of close that anecdote by noting there's a lot more work to do, and I think we can talk about that as we continue the discussion. But I want to come back to you, Nicole, and ask you about your role leading a business and human rights program and describing for us how transparency reporting kind of fits inside the company in the broader kind of inside the broader concept of transparency.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the history that you shared is so important to sort of understand as we, consider where this fits within companies, where it's fit over time and where it fits today. At Verizon, our work rests on a set of key pillars, and one of those pillars is accountability and transparency, as you were alluding to. And I think, we in our company recognize that transparency is an important way that we can communicate about how governments are impacting human rights through their law and through their policy, and also about the role of companies in respecting human rights. And it's for that reason, or those reasons, that our company has placed a high priority on transparency reporting for a long time now, really since, the origins of this program and all the way back to Yahoo. And so to give a little bit of an example, I was sort of thinking about, the evolution just within our company of these practices. And when Verizon Media, our tech and media arm, was formed a couple of years ago following Yahoo's acquisition by Verizon, we had as a first priority, really, among what we were working on at the time post-acquisition, to publish a new transparency reporting hub, really, for Verizon Media that would house the transparency reports and information for our house of brands, including brands like Yahoo and AOL. And at the time, we were really bringing together a number of different internet technology media brands, and we had this opportunity. So we set out to standardize reporting on government requests for user data, content moderation, produce new and combined sets of disclosures that went beyond what any of our individual brands had done before. And I think part of why we were, maybe poised and able to take advantage of that opportunity that came about and make some advancements in our transparency reporting was partially because we have a dedicated team in place in our company who's focused on these issues for the duration of its existence, and was able to step in at a time of significant transition and transformation and realize that transparency and accountability are premium in this work, and that there should be attention on those early on. But also, that our team and our company had been engaged on these issues in discussion with external, partners, groups, organizations. So I was thinking back, when I first started at Yahoo, the first conversation I joined in the Global Network Initiative, the multi-stakeholder organization in this space, was actually around practices in the transparency reporting area. There was a new practice around government reporting on government requests for content removal. And at the time, that was sort of the next generation step from the government requests for user data and what had been reported on those. And so it was an early conversation about, what was best practice, what was emerging, like what could be learned. And those conversations in GNI have only been, rich over time and helped inform our practice. And of course, we've also engaged with other groups that have come up over more recent years, like Ranking Digital Rights, that's looked at what is meaningful transparency and how does transparency impact practice, and how can you think about that, especially as someone who works on these issues within the company. That's been a useful dialogue to be part of. And then, of course, we've had so many of these type of discussions at Access Now's RightsCon over the years. So, really without this sort of engagement, I think the whole practice, wouldn't be as rich as it is today. So I know we're almost nearing our time. To wrap up, Michael, what do you see? Can you give us your forecast for the challenges, the opportunities ahead? Look into the future and tell us what's coming.
I'm not sure how far into the future I can look, but I will note that I think the challenges and the opportunities are really one and the same. And I thought that we could just spend a minute on three of the challenges / opportunities. The first is audience, and I think it's important to think about transparency reporting and have to step back and think about who the audience is for these reports, but really for the concept of transparency overall. It's consumers, it's governments, it's academics, it's civil society organizations, it's the press, it's really, it's all of those. It's not a single one. And that leads to kind of the second area where I think we have both challenges and opportunities. These are among the most innovative companies in history, but I feel like from that first moment when I heard about what became a transparency report and when I subsequently saw it a few weeks later in 2010, there hasn't been sufficient innovation. There are some kind of companies that are noteworthy in the user friendliness and digestibility of the transparency reports that they publish, and credit to them. And I hope that some of those steps become more standardized across industry in the US and outside for certain. But it feels like there's much more room on kind of understanding the various audiences and making a tool, and the same way you would design, a really useful and well-used product, to think about transparency reporting in that way. The third challenge and opportunity for the companies, and I look forward to the panel discussion afterward, is really around breadth and depth. I think we need to think more holistically about transparency as a cornerstone of accountability, and not just focus on law enforcement demands, whether in the US, outside the US, and there can be more detail. We need that. We need more detail. The Snowden revelations showed that sort of multi-stakeholder advocacy could lead to advances in transparency reporting. But we need to think about it in the same context, and I would give an example of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I don't mean just in hiring or in the composition of companies, but in the design, development, deployment of products. DEI principles need to be a core part of that. And we need to have companies sort of think holistically about how they're transparent with the entire community of stakeholders that I mentioned. We need more, certainly on law enforcement, more on content moderation, more on political ads, more on general consumer data collection activities. And you mentioned, Nicole, ranking digital rights, and that project and the indicators, I think, provide us all really a good starting place and often a roadmap. So I'll kind of close by saying that Google did indeed move us forward. It was an enormous leap, and credit to the company. But if I could, for the runners kind of among us, note, it's been more like kind of a corporate walk or a corporate race, leisurely, moving steadily with a goal, but the stakes are too high. And it feels like we need an Olympian effort. And I look forward to hearing the panel discussion and seeing the questions. I feel like there's much, much more to do here, and credit to those who have been innovators in the space. And thank you again to Access and to BSR for hosting us.
Well, thank you so much to you, Michael, and to Nicole for that insightful conversation. We've asked a few companies to present on their reports, as well as Greg Waters from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board to talk about transparency reporting metrics. So we'll also hear from Patrick Hasilius of Telia Company, from Kakao, and from Uttara Sivaram of Uber on their approaches to transparency reporting.
Hi all, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. My name is Greg Waters, and I am from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, most often known as SASB. So thanks so much to Access Now for allowing me a few minutes to speak here and plug an important research project that's ongoing at SASB. So we are an independent, nonprofit standard-setting organization, and we're dedicated to facilitating the disclosure of financially impactful environmental and social issues from companies to their investors. We exist because we believe that capital markets are a critical lever for achieving a more sustainable and just future. Our standards are industry specific and designed to capture a subset of information, sustainability information, that is most likely to impact financial performance of companies. And we are actively backed by a group of investors with around $60 trillion in assets under management. And our standards are being used to report by about 500 different companies across 70 different industries. And that growth is about 350% year on year. So we're really excited by the momentum we've achieved as an organization in driving for more comparable and complete sustainability disclosure. This audience understands why transparency around things like data privacy and content governance are really important societally. But there's also this financial impact angle, and that's why SASB has gotten involved. So I thought I'd spend a moment or two speaking to that. So the first line item I would say is on the revenue side. And I think if we think about content governance as what users see on a given platform and when, that really is critical to a company's business strategy, how they attract and retain not just users, but also advertisers. And that balance of monitoring for harmful content while protecting user freedom of expression. We see different approaches and strategies taken by different platforms depending on the design of their platform. From the cost perspective, of course, we now know that thousands, if not tens of thousands of people at various companies are reviewing content. And that obviously is a significant form of investment. The other would be the capital expenditure associated with automated flagging systems using techniques like machine learning. And the last thing I would mention on the financial side would be the regulatory piece, in that we know that the US and the European Commission, as well with the Digital Services Act, are mulling proposed changes that would severely potentially impact how companies not just moderate, but also kind of really show content to users. So major implications there in terms, if you're thinking of this with an investor lens, in terms of risk return profile, how might a different company's platform be impacted by different regulations is clearly of interest. So in terms of transparency reporting, obviously they're critical for accountability to a broad variety of stakeholders, but also the metrics that have been developed and are being used by a number of companies on areas like content moderation are also of interest to investors. So SASB standards actually already use a number of transparency reporting metrics. These include information about law enforcement data sharing, as well as content removal requests from governments. The next piece for SASB is we are now evaluating potential changes to our standards to include voluntary content moderation and content governance themes. So really eager to hear from companies and subject matter experts, such as the people on the panel that's about to come up here. We are open. We're a market-informed and consensus and stakeholder-driven organization in terms of understanding what are the most important issues and the best ways to be capturing the performance of companies on this topic. So eager to connect. So thanks again to Access Now for having me and allowing me to plug this project, and looking forward to the discussion. Take care, everyone.
Hi all. My name is Patrik Hiselius. I'm representing Telia Company, an ISP and mobile operator and TV provider in the Nordic and Baltics. And if you want to know more about Telia Company, please visit our homepage, teliacompany.com. So I'm glad Access Now provides access to a database on transparency reports, and now also gives access to this event about transparency reporting. And thanks for inviting Telia Company. Although I understand our reporting is one of the most read pieces on our homepage, it's difficult for me to know what you watching this event are looking for and how, therefore, for us to improve. So please have a look and give us feedback on how to improve. Both positives and negatives, thanks. At Telia Company, we say law enforcement disclosure reporting and not transparency report, because we do transparency in all areas of sustainability. That might be children's rights or environment or our work in the supply chain, gender equality, and so forth. And also on human rights impact assessments. The following are the two starting points for Telia Company's reporting. First and foremost, we encourage states to be transparent themselves about their use and scope of surveillance. We welcome, therefore, the yearly transparency reports published by the governments in such as Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Lithuania. So please do encourage states to do transparency reporting. To supplement those reports from states, our aim at Telia Company is to contribute to meaningful and oversight and discussion. So we publish these reports twice a year, a full report with context and other information each March, and then an update of the law enforcement requests each October. And we've done so since 2013. Secondly, as a side effect, our work to be transparent helps us in getting things in order because when we publish information, it needs to be correct. Over the years, we've added additional transparency to the actual statistics of law enforcement requests. So in addition to our statistics on the day-to-day thousands of conventional lawful intercept requests, we also provide information on unconventional requests and the number of such. That's about blocking, shutdowns, new legislation, etc., and how we have dealt with those. Secondly, we have added links to laws providing states with direct access. 3, we have also added links to laws mandating operators to do data retention for surveillance. We have also added the links to the government's own reporting, and we've added information on the extent of use of cell tower dumps, and lots of context and more. So I invite you to have a look into our latest March 2020 report. One feature of Telia Company's reporting, which I don't know if other companies do, is that our figures are audited, just as our financials. So Deloitte look into our figures and also ask sometimes about supporting documentation so that they can audit our figures. So which are the main challenges as to this reporting? We have a chapter in our March report on challenges and omissions. The biggest challenge, notably, is that the statistics on number of surveillance requests don't provide the full picture. Governments also have direct access, real-time network access, without requests. Regarding such direct access, Telia Company has no insight into the extent of surveillance, when, who, and what, and cannot provide statistics. What we can do, as we do in our reporting, is to publish links to such relevant laws in our respective markets. And as part of the Global Network Initiative, the GNI, we address this salient issue of direct access. Another challenge I wanted to mention here is that some readers try to compare figures between the countries. Several factors make it difficult to compare the statistics between countries. Telia, of course, have different market shares in different markets, and also the working methods within the authorities differ, and we don't know about their priorities and working methods. So, a very short summary. Thanks Access Now for arranging this important event. I myself look forward to look at the stream. On our reporting, first, why we do it? Well, our responsibility is to respect your privacy, but there are laws which mandate us to hand over data for surveillance. What we can do is to be transparent about that, how many requests we get, and the context about on such requests. Some things I try to highlight in this intervention. One is that Telia Company statistics is audited, and also a main challenge for transparency is direct access, where we cannot provide statistics. So do give us feedback, positive, negative, and on how we can improve. My Twitter handle is Patrik_Hiselius. Hiselius. Many thanks and take care. Thanks.
Digital responsibility for protecting user privacy. Kakao Transparency Report. Warm greetings from Korea. We are Kakao's policy team, and we are honored to be speaking to you at RightsCon about our transparency report. Kakao makes a better world with people and technology. As a mobile platform company, the privacy and protection of our users is top priority. Our goal for the transparency report is to present a comprehensive data set on the requests and status of requests made by government agencies for user information. This is one of the actions we take to strengthen transparency in ensuring the digital security of our users. Since 2012, we have been publishing the transparency report every 6 months. Here, we see the statistical data that are included in the transparency report for the first half of this year. We report the number of requests made by the Korean government regarding user information and the status of cases and accounts duly processed. The type of information that the government may request for are as follows: communication data, communication restricting measures, communication confirmation data, and search and seizure warrants. Kakao does not process requests for individual user information by government agencies without respecting official procedures. We make great efforts to increase people's access to information by improving the readability of our content. We present clear explanations on the terms, standards, and procedures relevant to the disclosure of user information in simple language on our website. The Transparency Report is a part of Kakao's efforts to fulfill our digital responsibility. First of all, it is significant in terms of the protection of user rights. It allows us to transparently report and release data on how we are handling government requests for user information. Secondly, as Kakao observes due processes on requests by government agencies, we believe that it is our responsibility entrusted to us by users to disclose such data in the transparency report so that everyone may view it. Lastly, Kakao's transparency report not only encompasses our endeavor to ensure user rights, but it also expresses our pride in keeping our users' information strictly guarded according to legal procedures. In such a dynamic and unstable digital environment, we make every effort to protect our users' rights and to fulfill our corporate responsibilities and promises. Committed to the promises we have made, Kakao strives to provide open and resourceful information for our users. In light of the COVID-19 crisis, we have published the Kakao COVID-19 report and aims to support the public with data and to share the ongoing national and global efforts in overcoming its challenges. As Korea's leading digital daily life platform, Kakao reveals analysis results on the pre- and post-pandemic changes in user data of Kakao services in the Kakao COVID-19 report. Please contact our team to learn more about our analyses. Let us all safely and wisely maneuver through these times. Take care. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Uttara Sivaram, and I lead Uber's public policy work on privacy and security, including the publication of our government transparency report. First of all, thank you to Access Now for hosting this event. Transparency reporting is incredibly important to holding companies and governments accountable, and it's good to take a step back and see how this practice has grown and evolved over the past decade. Uber published its first transparency report for our ride-sharing business in 2016, following in the footsteps of some of the companies being featured today. But in addition to counting the requests we received from law enforcement, our report was the first in the mobility space to include regulatory requests for data from government agencies like the California Public Utilities Commission and the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission. And that's because our business is a little different. Our technology connects riders and drivers both online and in the real world, a world that's regulated by agencies overseeing things like transportation, energy, and construction. And the data they usually ask us for involves Uber trips, where people go by using our platform. But even after names are excluded from this data, this information still carries the risk that passengers can be re-identified by examining patterns of movement and combining them with publicly available information. For example, if someone takes a ride to the grocery store from their home and the origin and destination of that trip is disclosed to the government, it can be a simple matter of using the yellow pages to identify who took that trip. And that's why, in every case, we work closely with government agencies to understand the legal basis for their request and make sure we're only providing what is strictly necessary. Beyond that, we use technical privacy methods like coarsening the resolution of location data and timestamps to reduce the uniqueness of every trip. By doing that, we reduce the risk that this information can be used to identify our users. And in many cases, regulators have altered their requirements in recognition of the privacy risks their requests can create. By publishing this report and including requests from these types of agencies, we want to stimulate a much needed conversation about government access to data, both within and outside of law enforcement. And for every year we've released our report, we've seen a steady rise in the number of these requests, as well as the number of users impacted as people turn to connected mobility options that they can access from their phone. Moving forward, it's really important that we not only urge more companies to release transparency reports, but also encourage a greater variety of companies to participate. That's the only way to fully capture how data flows between the private and public sectors. Furthermore, having a fuller picture of government data sharing across different sectors can help inform better and smarter regulation, addressing how governments can and should access information about users. We can all, I'm sure, envision a world that's powered by smart, data-driven public policy, as well as a user base that feels empowered and in control of their own data. That's why, in addition to publishing these reports, we as an industry need to invest in solutions that leverage aggregated and anonymized data that can drive positive social outcomes without putting consumer privacy at risk. There's a tremendous opportunity to learn from one another and improve transparency reporting. And I know Uber is eager to work with many of the companies and consumer advocates here today to accomplish that. Thank you, and I'm happy to stay on afterwards for any questions.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. That concludes the presentations and the videos. So now we're going to go to the live content. We've got an amazing panel of speakers here today. Without further ado, we'll get started. I'd love to hear reactions to that. We've heard from speakers all over the world, from a variety of types of companies, those who were around this process 10 years ago and before, as well as those who've just started. About half the folks on this panel work at organizations or companies that didn't exist 10 years ago. But we've grown. With power comes responsibility. With user growth comes abuse reports and disinformation campaigns, search warrants, and even executive orders. In my perch at Access Now, leading our business and human rights work and as general counsel, I've been able to watch this trend, and I would argue that outside events, even crises, have driven reporting. Voluntary disclosures are not high on the list for most startups or even maturing tech companies. Looking at the Access Now Transparency Reporting Index, we see a bump of reports in around 2014, 2015. I would argue that's due to the revelations of mass surveillance that Edward Snowden brought to the world. Civil society jumped on these moments and others in 2016, like the Brexit campaign, the 2016 US presidential vote, as well as the Me Too movement to drive reporting on terms of service and community guideline enforcement, as well as advertising transparency. And I'd love for the panelists to refute my theses. But I do think that most tech companies, like other institutions, know that transparency builds trust and can even help keep other stakeholders in check. So we'll ask this panel what trends they're seeing in the coming years, how we've gotten to where we are now, and how all tech companies, including any number of new sectors who exist now or who are coming online, can better get ahead of the curve on reporting and respect the human rights of their communities. So without further ado, I think it's proper to go straight to Google, to Alex Walden, who is a veteran of the company, now global head of human rights. This is, as we've heard, the company that pioneered transparency reporting 10 years ago. I'd love to ask Alex why Google started reporting. Is there lore? Have you heard stories? But perhaps more importantly, given the downtrend in some reports, a lot of companies put out one and they're done, as well as the rather notorious reputation at Google to start projects and then kill them. Why has Google continued and even expanded its reporting? Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Peter. And thank you to Access Now again for hosting this conversation. Human rights, transparency, and tech is near and dear to my heart and is really core to the work that I do at Google. So why did we start doing transparency reporting? If you rewind, and some of this is what Michael and Nicole hit on, but if you rewind back to the early 2000s, that was really the early days of when companies started receiving government requests for user data, government requests for information or to remove content. And so as we started to get these requests and push back on them, we started to feel like it was an important principle for us to think about what it meant for us to be transparent with our users about both what the company was doing and what governments were doing, the interaction between the two. And so, over a decade ago, we launched this effort to provide some of that information publicly. Then in September of 2010, it actually became itself a transparency report. And for us, we really do think it is about our users' trust, and it is also core to our commitment to human rights. And both of those pieces are important to how we continue to think about it. Since then, we have launched, I think we are now at 12 different transparency reports. So it is something that we remain committed to. We started with user data. We went to government requests for removal of content. And now we have reports on things like copyright. We have reports on things like traffic, internet traffic, regarding ads. And in 2018, we launched the YouTube transparency report. So we really have continued to iterate and expand on the breadth of areas of the business where we think it's important for us to share with users, both how we're interacting with government and how we're enforcing our own policies against our products.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think one area as well that Google and others have started reporting is around demographics and staff data. And I think building off Michael Samway's remarks, maybe we can hear more about that. Cool. I want to swing over to Reddit. Actually, we are going in order of seniority here. Reddit was started in 2005. It's mature despite its image. It was started on the East Coast. It's a social news aggregation and web content rating and discussion forum, app and website with up to 52 million daily active users globally. That's up a lot during COVID. And I think we want to hear from Jessica Shu, the director of policy there, about how their reporting has innovated over the past couple of years, with Reddit being really at the heart of social movements as well as the COVID-19 response. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you. Absolutely. Happy to speak to those issues. So Reddit issued its first transparency report in 2014 in the bump of transparency reports that you just cited. We're proud that we've been doing them for so long, and we're proud that we've been expanding them every year, and also that we've been recognized as a leader in the transparency reporting space. So for example, we were the only company to receive a perfect score in the last EFF, who has your back evaluation of company transparency. And so we really do think deeply about this. And it's important to us, especially because of Reddit's unique structure. So we follow, as you're familiar, a community moderation model where the users themselves on a volunteer basis are highly involved in our content moderation operations. So, a statistic that is in our transparency report that we disclose is that actually more than 99.7% of all content removals on Reddit actually happen at the user level by these volunteer moderators. And so because the users and the public really are partners with us in moderating the Reddit platform, it's really important that we disclose this data with them so that we can have a healthy relationship where our policies are understood and our actions are understood. Like other companies, we used to focus only on government requests in our transparency disclosures. But as I mentioned before, we've been expanding that out, and now it includes reporting on content removal actions that we take as a company in line with our content policy. And that was a really kind of big expansion for us. We've been doing that for the last 2 to 3 years now, and it taught us a lot about how to do transparency reporting and how to work cross-functionally with partners in the company to kind of get the data that you need. And I think that this is one of the biggest perceived barriers to companies doing transparency reports, especially for smaller companies like Reddit. You know, we're only around 700 total employees right now. But you know, I think the biggest hurdle that's perceived to reporting something for the first time is making sure that you actually have the data tracked, because of course, if you don't track it, you can't disclose it. And so there's actually kind of a year-long ahead of time preparation process that needs to happen before you do your transparency report, because it may entail tooling adjustments, which takes engineering resources that are often pretty constrained at smaller companies. But what I say when I'm talking to kind of my colleagues at smaller companies who are thinking of transparency reporting, or they want to do one, but they don't think that they have the data, or they don't think that they have the right data, is that it's really, really important not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Because, you know, if you don't have a specific thing tracked, or you don't have it tracked for the whole year, you know, you might have an approximate data point tracked, or, you know, you could report for the data that you have and then kind of start tracking it and do a full one next year. It's important to think creatively about what's meaningful to disclose for your platform in particular, because I think it's important to recognize that a meaningful transparency report is going to be really different for every platform, because we all represent kind of different models and different services and products, and that's okay. And I know that that can sometimes be frustrating for researchers and others, because they want to see an apples to apples comparison of transparency reports across the industry. But the reality is that these are not apples to apples services. Reddit is very different from Google, is very different from Uber, and our transparency reports each reflect that. And then kind of thoughts on continuing to expand transparency reporting and where the trends are going in the future. I think it's very important to remember that transparency isn't just something that needs to happen once a year, twice a year, or quarterly, or whatever your cadence is with your reports. I think it's important to think about transparency as kind of a company value. One of our values is default open. And also think about how you can integrate transparency efforts into the things that you're doing all year. And so, for example, you know, 2020 was a very particular year with very particular challenges. And one of those challenges was the racial justice reckoning in the United States. And as a part of that kind of national conversation that we were having, Reddit updated our content policy to more explicitly prohibit hateful content. And when you're making a significant content policy update like that, it's really important to measure it and see if it's working. And so, you know, while this might be a deep dive that's not kind of appropriate for the format of the annual transparency report, we really wanted to communicate with our users about what we were finding and what we were seeing. And so we created a dedicated subreddit where we talk about kind of interesting things that we want to disclose to the users, but they might not be right or fit into the transparency report. And so we discussed statistics that we had found about how much hateful content we had found on Reddit before and after the rule change. And we also discussed, you know, who was that hateful content targeted at? And that's a really important point, because one of the really great things about transparency reporting is that it helps you understand your own business better. And there's a really strong business case to be made for doing transparency reporting, because I can now go to my trust and safety team and say, we've got statistics here that say that most hateful content on Reddit is involving racial issues, and kind of less hateful content is involving kind of other types of issues. So that gives our safety team a lot of really valuable insights about where they want to direct their efforts. And so there's a powerful business case there that you can make, because it ultimately saves some resources, because we're not misdirecting kind of valuable engineering resources or valuable trust and safety resources to something that's not going to end up having a significant impact on the platform.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so many great points there. I think, you know, and you really pulled out your dependence on those, I guess, volunteer moderators. They're not paid, right? And I think this was a necessity, being the mother of invention. You were a small company, and I think you still are relatively small despite these 50 million active users. And I'd love to hear more also about your global reach. And so how do you ensure that these policies that you roll out are understood and are respected even when you're dependent on volunteer moderators?
Yeah, absolutely. That's it's a conversation that we're actively thinking about in the company. But I think what's great about kind of the decentralized community moderation model is that it internationalizes and localizes a lot better than a centralized enforcement model, because, you know, for example, something like hate speech is hugely contextually dependent. It's, you know, very sophisticated language. It relies on slang. It's often coded. And the community moderators who are a part of that community are going to be able to recognize something much better than we'll be able to recognize it, you know, sitting in San Francisco or sitting in New York or wherever we are. So we've been focusing on having more intentional conversations with these moderators and kind of creating moderator councils, really, where we speak, you know, directly over Zoom with kind of groups of our moderators to just understand what they're seeing, so that we can better direct our resources to building things that are going to be meaningful for them, for keeping their communities safe.
Thank you. Yeah, I imagine you'll get some upvotes for that response. Let's move to the other company on our platform and on our panel, and I am going to prioritize the companies here first. Sean Lee, at an even smaller firm, Discord, even newer, only about 5 years old, but also growing a lot during the COVID pandemic while folks are at home and looking to reach out and make social connections. Discord has been called Slack for gamers, but it's rapidly expanding right beyond that community. And you've done a lot of reporting around trust and safety. I want to say you're the only firm that actually reports the raw numbers of all the user flags you get. So I'd love to hear about your work there, and just to call out that you are the 3rd USF law alum. Go Dons on this panel. So thanks for joining us, Sean.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here, and thanks to Access Now for putting in all the hard work on such an important topic. I mean, actually, as Jessica said, right, like I think meaningful transparency reporting is different across companies, and I think that's actually where sort of our focus on user flagging and on enforcement came from. That I think a lot of what we sort of saw in our user base and in the discussion was that there was kind of, right, like enforcement is often a black box, right? And you don't really know why decisions are being made. You don't know how they're being made. Like there's just a lot of like uncertainty of like, oh, like why did my account get banned? Why did this post come down? And so I think we really approach it from that level of like, oh, this is an area where there is a lot of uncertainty, where there's a lot of lack of clarity, and we wanted to address that. For us, I think the transparency reporting really comes from, right, like it is about showing users like what is going on, and users, civil society, right, the press, like what's going on, what it looks like. I think the analogy is sort of that, like we look at these transparency reports, especially on the enforcement side, kind of like annual crime reports that like a city or a state issues, right? In the same way that you sort of probably want to know what like a city's crime rate looks like across various things before you move there, it probably also makes sense that you would kind of want to know what your online space looks like before you go there. And so that was sort of the root of us driving this. I do think that there are a number of companies now that are reporting, you know, content enforcement actions to some degree. And I think it really like depends on the company, right? On you can imagine that at some of the, right, like because Discord tends to be a more private company, right? Like you have to have an account, you have to join servers, you can't just sort of like drive by and browse, right? Like I think the reporting metrics are different, which is why I think it is hard, as mentioned, to sort of compare these things apples to apples. But I think by and large, right, the more transparency that we can sort of bring on any of these topics, right, the better it is. The one other thing on being a small company, yeah, I think we're a little bit over 280 people right now, and we've done transparency reports now for 3 cycles, so 6 months, right, a bit over a year and a half. I think it really is about just prioritizing it and making sure that you make those investments early, right? The earlier on you spend time and resources on being able to gather the data, collate the data, and make sure that you're presenting it well, the easier it is later on. You don't have to wait, right? Like we went from, you know, sub 50 million users to 100 million daily users over the last year or so, and we just put a lot of that infrastructure in 2018, and that's all paid off now. I think as with a lot of companies, as with I think every company really here, certainly, you know, we continue to try and make transparency reporting better, and part of that is giving more context, right? Part of that is making it accessible, not just I think to civil society that is interested in sort of seeing what things look like from across every platform, but also like talking actually directly to our users and being like, hey, when you report a user for harassment, this is what happens, right? This is what it looks like. This is like what you can expect. Because I think at the end of the day, right, like having a model that kind of is more, maybe a little bit closer to, for example, the American judiciary model, right? Where you, in most cases, can actually see like how a case went down and what happened to it, right? Like what the entire sort of like steps in the investigation, in the prosecution, in the assessment were, right? I think that engenders the trust in the company, right? In the process, really, that I think we're all looking for. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I did want to ask, you know, because you were in tech, I think in trust and safety, even before going to law school and then came out. Were there rules? It sounds like you took a lot from the process of law, and you know, maybe in due process, and are applying it here. Are there rules? Are there substantive rules, say the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that you're also drawing from in the law?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the fields of trust and safety and content moderation and the law are pretty close, right? Not just for, I think, you know, regulatory reasons or stuff like that, but I think that fundamentally the study of law is really, right, like a study of the systems, you know, contractual systems that allow society to operate. And I would say that, you know, from both, of course, like history and how governments currently operate, and of course, the excellent work that all of these NGOs are doing, right? There's a lot of stuff that we draw from to understand how trust and safety processes at Discord should work.
Awesome, thanks. And yeah, I think our next speaker is going to be able to provide that that macro overview again. Dunstan Allison Hope is vice president at BSR. BSR predates even Google, founded in 1992, and has really was at the forefront and continues at the forefront of the trend of business respect for sustainability and human rights. Dunstan, I'm wondering, we've drilled down from, you know, some of the largest tech companies to some of the newest and smallest. Where is the tech sector in comparison with the rest of the business universe? I'd love for you to give us an overview. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I was going to open by saying, as nearly 30 years old, we're probably the oldest organization on the panel here, and you stole my line. So first of all, thank you for hosting this important discussion. We have been working with companies on issues of transparency across a range of different issues going back to the early 1990s. And so it's been really encouraging to see the evolution of transparency reporting in the technology industry over the past decade or so. And so when it comes to issues of transparency around relationships with law enforcement agencies, how companies share data with law enforcement agencies, as well as the broader sort of content governance field, I think the technology industry stands way ahead of other industries. And I think in reflecting about the past decade of transparency reporting and thinking about the next decade, the key sort of thought that came to mind for me is that what we'd like to see over the next decade are more transparency reports published by companies outside of the technology industry. So, you know, while the scope of transparency reporting has evolved over time, I still think at their core, it covers the relationships companies have with law enforcement agencies, how they manage those relationships, and how they share data with law enforcement agencies. But of course, tech companies are not the only ones that have those relationships. Tech companies are not the only companies that share data with law enforcement agencies. Whether it's the retail industry, financial services, healthcare, travel, automotive, logistics, all of those industries in different ways have relationships with law enforcement and share data. And so what we would like to see are reports from companies across a much wider range of issues, much wider range of industries covering similar issues to those that are covered in technology industry transparency reports. Now, somebody made the point, who are the audiences? Transparency for what purpose? And I think for us, we undertake a lot of human rights due diligence with companies, and we find the transparency reports to be a really helpful contribution to that human rights due diligence, both because the company has got its own sort of house in order ahead of time, and so there's an organized way of understanding the company's impact on privacy or other human rights, for example. But also it gives us a sort of head start. If we're doing a human rights assessment for a telecoms company or an internet company, a transparency report gives you a head start on that process. And my fear is that when we do human rights due diligence with companies in other industries, we lack some of that insight on how they might impact rights to privacy, or how other rights may be impacted as a result of violations to privacy rights, and how that might manifest itself in a range of other contexts.
And this isn't just voluntary. I mean, I think when this started, this was largely voluntary, right? But we're moving to a world where regulation is going to be driving company action, right? Can you tell us about what might be coming in the EU, especially around human rights due diligence?
Yeah, so in the EU, there are proposals for mandatory human rights due diligence by companies. And so that would be pretty much all companies of all industries of all sizes, and they would be expected to apply an approach that's very similar to that which is in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And so that means reviewing all of your activities across your entire value chain against all human rights. And so what intrigues me is if companies from non-technology industries do that effectively, they are inevitably going to come up against how we share data with law enforcement agencies and how we collaborate with law enforcement agencies. So I wonder whether that regulatory process is going to result in greater understanding of these issues in other sectors. And we were founded 30 years ago, what have you, before many of the technology companies that exist today exist. And so we're working on human rights impacts with companies from a range of other industries. And so that's something we're really looking forward to over the coming decade.
Thanks so much, Dunstan. So we've heard from the people producing the reports. We've heard from the person telling the companies to produce the reports. And now I think it's time to hear from those who actually use and read, who's the audience for these. This is the point where if we were at RightsCon, I'd asked a poll of who's actually read a full transparency report that they didn't write, and who's found them useful in their work. So maybe you at home can just raise your hand. Let's go to Louise Matsakis, an experienced journalist at publications like Wired and Motherboard, but is now writing at a fantastic new nonprofit journalism project, Rest of World, founded by a former tech exec. Rest of World tells stories where tech, culture, and human experience collide. Louise, welcome. And can you tell us who are these reports for, and do you think they're successful at telling a story? Might be muted. We needed one person to.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Is that working? Okay. So I think one thing that's good to note is that rest of world doesn't cover the West. So that's sort of where the name comes from. We only cover Asia, Africa, South America, Latin America, and sort of Eastern Europe. So these reports are incredibly important to our reporting, especially because these are often governments that are not transparent whatsoever. And these transparency reports give really important insight into how these governments are behaving. For example, we saw India block TikTok this year, and it was really interesting to look at TikTok's transparency report and see that India was one of the top, governments that was requesting data from the company, and that indicated to me that they were, potentially upset with some of the content on the platform. Right? They had a high number of removal requests, and that told me a story that was different from the story that the Indian government was saying, which was that this was about, India-China relations. But to me, the transparency report kind of showed that instead this was a story about perhaps censorship and about wanting to, clamp down on free expression. So these reports are incredibly important for showing those sorts of trends. They really provide a lot of insight into what governments are doing in places where they don't really want to speak to journalists like me. I think that there are ways that they're not working. For example, I have noticed that a lot of companies turn to transparency reports long after they have faced scandals over content moderation or over government surveillance. For example, we saw that a lot with Zoom this year, and Zoom actually missed the first deadline to release its transparency report, and it's still sort of TBD about when they're going to release it. And that brings up another point that Dunstan was making, is that we see a lot of companies like Google have a great legacy here with transparency reporting, but I really want to see a wider range of tech companies that are handling user data. That's, both like telcos, that's sort of like software like Zoom. And I really want to see sort of like not just the major social platforms take up this initiative. And I hope that sort of pressure from government regulation will make that more possible. But this is a really important practice. And I think that, a lot of journalists like me would be worse off without transparency reporting.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and can you expand though and tell us more about how this is useful in other countries and whether this practice is actually being taken up by non-Western companies? We had, I think, just one. We had Kakao give us a video as well as Telia based in Europe, but the rest have been mostly U.S. companies we're talking about.
Yeah, so this is not really happening in a lot of places, right? I think both because of government pressure and because there's not a lot of other incentives for companies to take up this sort of reporting. But we have seen TikTok, for example, which is a Chinese company that's now operating in, Western countries, take this up. I think because of the sorts of pressure from governments, from civil society, from journalists to open up about this data. Because the nice thing about this data and making it as public and as transparent as possible is that, it allows you to kind of escape a lot of questions, because you can say, look, the data's all here, this is what we've seen, and it's important for it to be as comprehensive as possible. And you can sort of see trends over time, especially, I've seen some companies take up this practice for a couple of years and then say, like no one's really looking at it. And that's a huge problem, because it's really, a big indicator for us to see, okay, 5 years ago, Egypt was only sending 10 requests a quarter to this tech company, and now they're sending 100 or 200. That's a huge increase and indicates that there's something happening there between the user base of that platform and the government. Another big factor that I really like to see, or a big reporting metric, is how often are those requests denied, because that tells me that there's some sort of overreach happening there, right? Like if most of the requests are accepted, then it's perhaps, there's a good relationship there between law enforcement and the platform, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. But if a high percentage of those requests are getting denied, that indicates to me that that government is maybe, overreaching into people's privacy. And it's good to see the platform sort of standing up in that way, right? It's not a good sign if a tech company is accepting every single request they get from every government. That's a very bad sign, really. So, seeing those sorts of metrics can be really helpful to understand how governments are interacting with tech platforms. And also just to see sometimes when they don't seem to be intervening at all, because that also tells me that there's maybe, potential problems there. I think there's sort of a good balance where law enforcement and governments do want to interact with these platforms, do want to participate in safety in legitimate cases. But the transparency reports are the only way to sort of see to what extent that is happening and how that relationship is evolving over time.
Right, and you can track the rates of compliance, and it seems like governments are learning better how to request data and demand data from companies, right? Thanks. Great. So another key stakeholder group that has used these reports and really made the numbers meaningful is of course academia, and we're glad to welcome Elizabeth Renieres, who's affiliated with Harvard's Carr Center as well as the Berkman Klein Center, but is now interim policy at Ranking Digital Rights, the fantastic foundation founded by Rebecca McKinnon, a project of the New America Foundation. And Elizabeth, I'd love to hear more about where you see reporting going and where really Ranking Digital Rights is leading the reporting towards as we pass 10 years.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to Access Now for hosting. So Ranking Digital Rights has been publishing a corporate accountability index since 2015. In 2015, we ranked 16 companies on 31 indicators, and in our forthcoming 2020 index, we'll be ranking 26 companies on 58 indicators. So it gives you a sense that norms really are starting to emerge, and consensus is starting to build on both normative and non-normative standards. But it's still challenging because, as you noted, Peter, this trend really emerged in part after the Snowden revelations. And so what we still see is a residual imbalance between transparency on government demands versus enforcement of companies' own internal rules and policies, things like terms of service enforcement. And this is also, of course, partly due, as some others mentioned, to things like GNI membership, which focuses on government requests. But for example, in the 2015 RDR index, not a single company reported on terms of service enforcement. And over time, we've seen more detail and improvements in that area, to the point where in our forthcoming index, we've actually created an entire indicator family around things like enforcement of internal policies. So for example, with terms of service enforcement, separating things like account versus content restrictions. We've also asked for more details around advertising content and advertising targeting policies and internal enforcement of those. So the changes are there, although they're incremental. But one of the biggest challenges we see, and an area of focus in the future, is that companies are still defining the nature and the parameters of transparency and transparency reporting. Really, we can't let industry set the terms. We do need government, civil society, academia, and researchers, and really importantly, communities who are really affected and who stand to have their human rights impacted to be substantively involved in the process of developing the standards and the indicators for these transparency reports. Another thing to note is that we are getting more sort of quantitative and substantive transparency. So the what, right, around actions taken, posts removed, things like that. But they still tend to be aggregated, and aggregation is a huge problem. When things like types of content or restrictions or even types of rules enforced are aggregated, it really blurs the picture for some of these stakeholders, particularly in civil society, academia, and researchers, and really undermines our ability to understand and interpret the reports. So there, we would strongly encourage looking at the Santa Clara principles that really break down the effective type of reporting metrics there. But an important thing to note in the future is that we need to get more of the what, but we also need more of the why and the how. So we need more qualitative reporting. We need process transparency. The process transparency is really important because what it does is it creates sort of replicable standards. It creates the basis by which we can actually implement and design effective accountability standards. And in process transparency, this is data about rationale around how rules are formulated, how policies are developed, how actions are taken and decisions are made, even things like the relationship between human versus automated decision-making, how moderators are trained, how training data sets are developed, from the rationale, for those methodologies. And as Jessica pointed out, the companies and services are really different. Nevertheless, the process transparency is sort of an area where there can be more alignment, and in some ways is even more important because it forms the basis for these effective interventions that I outlined. So in terms of the substantive transparency, we are seeing better disclosures there. But again, even on things like very basic things like data collection and use, we're not seeing enough information around, for example, inferred or ambient data, which we know are really fundamental and have a really profound impact on people's privacy and other fundamental rights. We need more transparency around the use of algorithms and targeted advertising, which, as a co-panelist noted, will be a focus in the Europe's Digital Services Act as well. So that's an area where there's likely to be regulatory intervention. We still lack context. A lot of information disclosed is decontextualized. So without recontextualizing the content, it's not going to be reproducible and it's not going to form the basis for the emergence of norms and standards. And really, as I noted at the outset, these transparency reports are still largely a matter of corporate best practice and goodwill. But we are at the point where we do need legally binding requirements. So some of the promising interventions, promising developments in that regard are that we're seeing better data, for example, on appeals. So appeals is an area where traditionally we haven't seen much information. We often just got raw data or numbers, but we're starting to see more information around, for example, the range of enforcement decisions, but they can be better, right? So instead of just knowing you can appeal a granular decision, can you appeal things like downranking or algorithmic manipulation or other interventions or automated decision making? And if you can, what are the factors there? So there's also obviously room for improvement, as I noted, on advertising policies. Often those things are not even in transparency reports, but they may be things like informal company blog posts. So that is a sort of area for potential process standardization as well. I'll stop there, Peter, in the interest of time, and happy to take specific questions.
Thanks. That was amazing. Yeah, you hit algorithms without saying artificial intelligence, I think, which we all appreciate. So no, that's fantastic. Yeah, and we are getting questions about whether any companies are reporting on algorithmic transparency, on explaining their algorithms, opening up that black box. And we've got that, as well as a couple other company-focused questions. So I think I'll probably go there. But one is around the auditing of transparency reports. I think Telia gets their report assured. Do any others? Is it effective? We've got a request on Canadian authorities requesting info. I don't know if there are any secret Canadians on this panel. And then, but I do want to go first to Alex. I saw you shaking your head and nodding a lot at what Elizabeth was saying around process transparency, especially. And then if you could just tell us, what Google might have planned for your reports.
Well, I'm not sure there's anything I can share about what we have planned just yet, but I do really want to underscore the importance of everything that was just said around the importance of context and qualitative transparency. I think we have been really trying to think about, we have all of these transparency reports that provide metrics, and that's obviously very important to have the numbers around enforcement, what we're removing, what we're responding to. But at the same time, how can people understand what our policies actually are and how we enforce them and how we develop them? And so, we've begun to do that in particular ways, like we have a disinformation white paper, and that really walks through how we think about the issue, how we have created policies across each of our products, how we enforce those. And so that's one way where we've been thinking about how can we help folks understand what we're doing on a particular issue and how that relates to content moderation. We've done a similar paper on information quality that's focused on how we remove, raise up, reward content across all of our products as well. And so that's another effort to help folks understand what we're doing with respect to removals, but also what we're doing with respect to ranking too. And the other piece, I think we even think that context is important when you look at things like our legal removals, that's our shorthand, our report on government requests for removal of content. And we do include annotations as part of that report. And so what that does is help, the purpose of that is to help users and anyone using the report understand why there might be spikes in the report. And so you can see that, for example, on Russia, where the year that we implemented our compliance with the VPN law, and you would see a spike in the URLs removed across search. And you see that happen in other countries, where you can see when a local law was implemented and how we responded to that. So it really is, I think, it continues to be about companies and governments. That is one important piece that I think we should not lose, and continue to advocate for governments to be transparent so that we have a holistic understanding of engagement with each company, but then also what the government is doing. But then really to help folks understand our products. The other thing that we've done is start to develop entire sites that are focused on helping people understand the product. So we launched How Search Works earlier this year. We have, we launched How YouTube Works earlier this year. We have long had How Search Works and another site called How Play Works. And that walks through all of the policies, sort of how we implement them, the way that we think about the product, because certainly how we think about it, that gets back to what we should be driving for in transparency and how it looks different across each of the kind of type of service. So what we want from transparency on search is maybe not the same thing that we would want from transparency on YouTube, but we're trying to learn. And so when we think about comparability across types of service, understanding how the product works is a big piece of that. When it comes to algorithms and how they work, we are also spending a lot of time working on that and trying to figure out what does meaningful transparency look like? How much are we talking about explainability, just understanding what in fact we're doing, and what types of transparency are meaningful to our users, to the public, to experts like the ones on this panel who are probably more familiar with what companies are doing, as well as regulators. And so how do we, make that information more usable to all of those audiences? Those are things that we are currently focused on. And I think, things like the EU DSA and other regulations and other policy conversations are helping to move the discussion forward for the industry.
Right. Yeah. Certainly is regulation coming around the corner. And to that, Dunstan, can you tell us about assurance and how you can actually, are these reports trustworthy and who says so? And then maybe also talk about ways that reporting here in these rather limited reports can fill the much larger gap around the range of human rights that are impacted by tech companies.
I did just want to pick up on the point about assurance. So assurance exists for two reasons. Assurance exists to make sure that the things in the report are right, but it also exists to make sure that the right things are in the report. And we often think about assurance as making sure the things in the report are right. In other words, making sure they are accurate, that they are comparable over years, over time. It's less common to think about assurance as making sure that the right things are in the report in the first place. And so that, for me, is an interesting angle when it comes to the lack of reporting by other tech companies or companies in other industries. So if they're doing effective, full human rights due diligence that covers the full list of human rights, and you ask the question, are the right things in the report? In other words, the cumulative disclosures that they have, I think you might identify that there's a big gap here in many companies. So when we think about assurance, I guess my point is, don't just think about it as, are the things in the report right, but also think about it in terms of, are the right things in the report in the first place? Peter, I forget the second part of your question, however.
Yeah, I was asking, how can these reports fill the general gap around reporting on non-financial matters like human rights and governance?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting trends over the past decade, of which the transparency reporting trend has played a full part, has been increased disclosure by companies on very specific issues of interest to very specific target audiences. And one of the things that I would like to see from companies going forward are reporting strategies that, on the one hand, meet the needs of investors or other analysts who might want the strategic overview of the company. On one page, what are the big issues we're addressing and how we are addressing them? And then on the other hand, provide the really detailed, complex information that specific audiences want and achieve both in combination. And I think often we have this conversation about, well, does anybody really read transparency reports? In my experience, they do, and there are very specific, very important audiences who then use that insight to inform their interactions with others. So I think I would answer your question by saying we'd love to see strategic approaches to disclosure by companies, of which this very detailed information around law enforcement relationships and other elements of transparency reporting would be an important part.
Thanks, Dunstan. I want to throw to Uber. Uber innovated by showing requests from airport authorities, right, which is a key stakeholder for them and their clients. There's a specific question about, for Uttara, can we get data on country-specific government and legal requests from Uber?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say visit our transparency report site. You can access it from the main Uber page. Currently, our transparency report is limited to the US and Canada, but we're actively looking to expand our report. And I think that, the complexity with that is just that, regulatory reporting is enormously complex. And you'll see that when you take a look at the report. Trying to identify, other regulators, transport regulators, land use regulators globally has been a challenge. But again, to the points that every panelist has made, it's an investment worth making, and we're looking forward to taking that next step.
Thank you so much. Is anyone else want to jump in? We've just got about 1 or 2 minutes left. Love to hear any closing thoughts. Burning, what's really in your nerdy heart of desire? Yeah. All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining. I think everyone is all in this in terms of trying to decide and understand what people need to know about how their companies work and how you process data, and how we can make reporting more meaningful. And I want to thank all of the panelists for joining. I will be handing off next to our illustrious RightsCon director and not secret Canadian, and she will take us away. Thanks, Nikki Gladstone.
Great, thanks so much for that very kind introduction, Peter. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us, and to everyone for tuning into this first event in our 10th anniversary series for RightsCon. We're really looking forward to, over the course of the next few months in the lead up to our 2021 event, celebrating a decade of convening for human rights in the digital age. And our next event will take place on June 7th to 11th, 2021, fully online. Right now, our call for proposals is currently open until January 19th, and it's a great opportunity to continue conversations like this on transparency reports and a lot of the other really critical program areas that will be explored in the RightsCon program. So you can learn more about that at rightscon.org, and we really hope to see you there. I will throw it back to Isedua to close out the panel for today.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki, and thank you to Peter. Thank you to Nicole and Michael and our whole host of panelists who spoke today. I think the conversation we had was really insightful, and has helped give us a clear idea of where transparency reporting needs to go moving forward. So I'd encourage everyone to keep this conversation going after the event. We'll follow up with a link to watch this video for those who couldn't watch live, and find other ways to continue to engage this community in how we can improve transparency reporting going forward. So yeah, just thanks again for taking some time out of a Friday in December to join a panel about transparency reporting. We really appreciate it and wish you a very good day. Thank you.